we're discussing today, and in fact counters the Tilley and Kelly studies that have already been alluded to today. But even before we get to that, we were sent in our documents an analysis of the regional agreements states capacity assurance plans by North Carolina Waste Awareness and Reduction Network. It says, and maybe this isn't correct, and someone can want to address this, but it says the overcapacity in excess of the projected needs of the regional agreement states for 1995 for the management categories that the governor has committed North Carolina to provide as follows. And there are 4 categories. I won't read through them all, but the first is solvents recovery. North Carolina commitment, 16,000 tons. Regional overcapacity, 911,000 tons. That's not consistent with what's verbally been said, but that's what's in the written materials. But that immediately then takes one back to the material that talks about the provision in the interstate agreement that says no hazardous waste facility shall be established pursuant to this chapter 130-B unless the governor determines that such facility is essential and is in the best interest of the state. I did not find in the material a determination of that having been determined by the governor and on what criteria it was determined. So my first question, I guess, is how did the governor make that determination? When was it made? And on what factors was it made?
Your first question, as I recall, was directed at Mr. Hennett, and we'll take them one at a time. You may want to repeat it so that you'll know what you're asking.
Are you aware of the wing study?
That was your second question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Direct that to Dr. Turner.
All right. What was the expense that we've incurred looking at the site so far?
At the Umstead Farm location, a little over $200,000.
Thank you.
Total for all locations.
The state has spent from the inception of the process for the Treatment Commission back in 1985 about $3.5 million.
$3.5 million. That was authorized by law.
Yes, sir.
And of that $3.5 million, you're saying 200,000 of it was spent on the Umstead property.
On defining the parameters of that site based on the drilling and the sampling and the wetlands and those things.
And a large part of the rest was done for consultant studies that were general for the whole state and hearings and all of those things.
Yes,
before you could begin to wean down from the large number of sites.
Yes, sir.
And how much money do you have left?
Not very much.
Do you know?
Less than $50,000 in our reserve fund plus operating expenses.
Which means that, well, let me put it another way. Do you have any other sites you want to look at?
At this point in time, the Commission has not directed us to look at any other sites.
All right. Your second question was about the wing study, and you're going to ask Dr. Turner about that.
Secretary may want to offer you a golf course to look at. I don't know. Excuse me.
The wing study, I have.
You're not familiar with that?
I am not familiar with it at all.
Thank you.
Your next question was about the report that indicated excess capacity. Mr. Hunter, do you want to respond to that? This was the...
This is from the North Carolina Waste Awareness and Reduction Network. I don't know how that's affiliated with what your commission's been doing.
It is not affiliated with our commission at all, Commissioner. It is a report that was prepared by that organization. There's been several questions about the validity of those numbers, about how those numbers were calculated, put together, and whether or not that is a true representation of the capacity. I showed you before the chart that we had up here showing North Carolina's commitment to the regional agreement on these two components we're talking about citing and how much waste is in North Carolina that would be available to fill those two needs. That's based on a very recent study by an independent environmental consulting firm.
Mr. Hennett, further on that question, wasn't there a study done by the Governor's Waste Management Commission about the capacity needs for the state in order to satisfy the Environmental Protection Agency, that we knew what our amount of waste generated was 5 years ago and at present, and we knew what our capacity was in North Carolina previously and at present, and we forecast what the amount generated would be and the capacity would be, and that's the basis on which we came to the conclusion of the amount of waste that we would have to treat in order to satisfy our neighbors that we were worthy to and serious about meeting a part of our responsibility so that we could get in this agreement.
That's true, sir. The 1986 amendments to the Superfund Act required that each state go back to the president and make a recommendation as to how they were going to manage their waste for the next 20 years. And that capacity assurance document is from whence we extracted the information to predict the kind of waste management capacity that would be needed.
And the document that you've referred to, Commissioner Brooks, really doesn't have a whole lot to do with that. Essentially what they did, best we can make out, was to take that amount of waste that's going to landfills now and assume that that'll always go to landfills, even if it's something that the federal laws and EPA regulations are being changed to forbid them from going to landfills, which means more of it's going to have to be incinerated or distilled for recycling.
So that
or
document doesn't
neutralized.
really speak to this particular collection of waste.
It proposes to, but I don't believe it does.
Mr. Commissioner, may I elaborate one more time on that document? The capacity assurance document that was required by the EPA or by the Superfund amendments required that North Carolina and all the other states project for 20 years in the future its waste management needs and its waste minimization capabilities. As a result of that, we were to take into consideration certain waste that would come into the realm of being regulated hazardous waste. And I'm not certain, but I believe that the document that you have in front of you may be a retrospective review as to what existed in the past and what is expected to be there as a result of what's there in the past.
For information, we did a performance audit on the state's management of hazardous waste. It was issued in July of '89. And I think the section in there on how that is determined or not determined would probably be a good source, because we've got that information basically from the state records and so forth.
When was that done?
July. It was released in July of 1989.
Your final question, I believe, was about the certification by the governor of the need for waste treatment facilities.
The final
And-
question of that series, I have some more.
Oh, okay. Well, I only know the ones that you've shared with me so far, Commissioner
Yes,
Brooks.
sir. Thank you.
And I recall that back prior to the completion of the agreement with the other 4 states and prior to ratification of that by the North Carolina General Assembly, I was given documentation that I believe had been reviewed by the Attorney General's staff and the the Governor's Waste Management Board that set forth the certification of what our need was for purposes of trying to comply with the Environmental Protection Agency's expectation of us under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And on the basis of that, I authorized the hazardous waste, it may have been the Treatment Commission at that time, prior to, that was the predecessor of the Management Commission, mostly the same people. But it authorized the Hazardous Waste Treatment Commission to proceed to look for a comprehensive list of sites for landfills, incinerators, metal recovery, aqueous treatment, all of the things that we would need to do if we were going to go it alone, because many legislators had been very vocal in their claim that they would insist that we go separately and not agree to take anybody else's waste or get in any agreement. And as they were beginning to do that work, the General Assembly did come into session and approved the multi-state agreement, and based on that and under the authority of that, another document was submitted to me to sign, which certified that there was a need for us, that the amount of incineration capacity was moderately larger than we needed by ourselves, but it was the dowry, in effect, that earned us the right to have favored treatment by these other states, not only so that they would willingly and without objection accept or interruption accept our waste from industries in North Carolina, but also so that it would satisfy the needs for taking care of our waste. But thanks to the courtesy and generosity and friendliness of these neighboring states, could certify right now that there was capacity available to us on a preferred basis. And all of those things I did. If you don't have a copy, we'll try to get you a copy. You'll enjoy reading that.
Is that determination material in what we have been sent?
I think the capacity assurance document that is the basis for the governor's determination has not been sent to you. It's a very thick document, and the governor's actual letter of the recommendation, I think, is a part of the 700-page document that we included for your review.
Okay. We'd like to have a copy of that determination.
Governor, Mr. Hennett, would you arrange to get
I'm sorry. Dr. Little is here from the Governor's Waste Management Board, and you did say that.
Well, Dr. Little, would you see that Commissioner Brooks gets another copy even after we vote? Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Governor, a request to the chair
Lieutenant Governor
before
Gardner.
Mr. Brooks continues, because I don't want to miss his probing questions. Could we have a 10-minute recess to attend to duties?
Well, any member that needs to be excused, we would still have a quorum if you want to
Well,
step up.
I would hate
You don't
to
want to
miss
miss
the
a
line of
thing.
questioning that's going on right now.
Thank you, Governor. If we could come back to order, please. Let me ask everyone to take your seats. Just your observation. If you would take your seats, we'll try to conclude our business shortly. Commissioner Brooks has indicated that he has some more questions. Anyone else want to be recognized? Close the debate. Let somebody else. If you would resume your seats, please, we will call the meeting back to order. And we'll take up where we left off. Commissioner Brooks is recognized.
Thank you, Governor. I have several questions, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. Mr. Hennett may best be the one. If there are others who can answer the questions, please indicate so. Combination of questions with regard to whether a 2-mile buffer zone is enough, and second, and perhaps related, is the fact that we're talking about a site within a mile of I-85, and looking through the materials, I could not find an emergency plan on where the traffic on I-95 would be diverted for the 6 months that I-95 might be closed in case of a major spill and pollution, contamination. What kind of emergency plan is there?
Mr. Commissioner, as the previous attorney suggested, that in the document that we provided for you, we said that that information was to be discussed later, and the reason it is to be discussed later is because the statute says that one of the things to be discussed with the preferred site community committee is evacuation, emergency response, and contingency planning. So that could best be done, according to the statute, with the people after you have designated preferred site. That's why we said that the information that they submitted was very good information. It gave us a head start on the number of emergency response vehicles and all the other things that were in the local community, but all the details that you're asking for would actually be hammered out with the preferred site committee.
I understand a part of the answer. I guess I don't understand that part, that I understand the local evaluation and emergency as it impacts on the community. I don't understand why that operation and procedure is contemplated as being satisfactory for the diversion of all the traffic on I-95 on a major interstate between Greensboro and Winston-Salem and Charlotte and Richmond, that might have to be totally diverted on a permanent basis for 6 months.
I think the first response, sir, is that the General Assembly suggested to us that we look at sites that were most proximate to the interstate highway, and second past that, that the process to determine what routes would be used as alternates in case there was some reason to shut down the interstate would be worked out as part of the plan for environmental impact statements, for the permit applications that are required for emergency response and contingency planning, and with the local committee. That's why the information doesn't exist at this time.
Well, fine, I'll accept that answer. I'm just impressed that the magnitude of the fact we may not have an alternative period in terms of that situation, judging by the empirical evidence of observing the load of traffic on that road, impresses me as well. Pages 60 to 79 in this material depicts a tremendous amount of Indian artifacts that have already been found in proximity of this very area. And of course, we have a Commission on Indian Affairs, which I had the privilege to serve on. They're meeting at this very hour across the street. And I'm interested in what will be the ultimate fate of Indian artifacts that are generously displayed throughout even the report that has been shared with us.
Well, the statute requires the restriction of the site based on historical site designation. These Indian artifacts that were found there have not been designated as a historical site. The commission has suggested that it would do everything possible in its siting of the components within this area to make sure that the least amount of, or the fewest amount of those artifacts would be disturbed in the process.
In addition to the constitutional instruction on the protection of wetlands and flatlands and so forth, open lands, GS 130B11C, 3 in parentheses, says a site shall not be located on wetlands, existing state or national parks or forests, existing historical sites, and existing wildlife refuges. And while formally we recognize that the area being discussed might not qualify under these titles, does not the sum of the area's attributes that have been examined and otherwise outlined not count for anything with regard to that policy statement?
I think it does, sir. We spent a considerable amount of time investigating the exact boundaries of wetlands on this particular site. We believe we know exactly where it is. We called the Corps of Engineers and asked them to come out and check our methodology to make sure we were doing it correctly. They confirmed that methodology, and we believe that there would be no net loss, as the legislation, as congressional action has required, of wetlands in this process to site this facility.
On page 232, you mentioned that the facility shall not be placed within 0.25 miles of a well. That's a magic number with regard to several facilities. But then later on indicate that this is within 0.3 miles of these various prohibited things. Is the difference between that minimum of the 0.25 and the 0.3 of that magnitude of protection that y'all feel comfortable that if the absolute minimum restriction is 0.25, that if it's within 0.3, that's okay?
I'm not certain as to the reference to point 3, Mr. Commissioner. I would be happy to answer it specifically. I think the Commission has said in its review of this information about this site that this particular site does meet the minimum of a 1,320 feet or a quarter of a mile to the nearest off-site groundwater well.
Page 235 cites wellheads that will be preserved within the 0.25 mile limit, and there's no staff response to that.
There were none on the site that we were able to find. No, because the rules suggest, Mr. Commissioner, off-site groundwater wells, not on-site. So we were addressing the off-site wells. Any wells on the site itself could be just closed down and not used.
Starting with the second volume you shared with us is the discussion, Petrovich versus Turner, pages 339 to 43, and there's very fascinating exchange set out there. And the key parts